Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another Friday morning coaching stream with myself, Matt Hunt, for Octopi Poker. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate you all joining us, as always. Today, we are going to dive into a topic that I've been getting a couple of requests for, and that I think is going to be a really useful one to really showcase some of the interesting aspects that you can get from comparing different sims and using the sim archive in sort of creative ways. And we're going to be talking about short stack bubble spots. Now, this is an area that players will spend a lot of time on simply because it feels good to cash tournaments. Everybody likes to cash more tournaments. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that exist about how these spots actually work and how we should play them based on what the sims look like, what the strategies are, and so on. In particular, I think before we actually dive into looking at some of the sims that I had planned here, which you can sort of see a little preview of what I'm going to be looking at on the screen here, I think one really important thing to be aware of is that when you're talking about ICM sims, when you're looking at some kind of ICM situation, ICM scenario, you always have to take into account the way that the ICM model actually functions, or the way that ICM sims are built, in that they can't take into account certain things. They can't take into account the fact that there's action going on multiple tables at the same time. So every time we interpret a sim, every time we look at something in an ICM spot and we try to figure out what we're supposed to do in that situation, we should look at the sim according to just understanding what the process was of how that strategy was arrived at, and what the risk premiums are, and recognize that if the risk premiums are quite high in the solver, in the sim, then we have to add on top of that the element of the sim being incapable of accounting for many tables happening at the same time. Because any ICM sim, it captures your stack's value at a moment in time, but it doesn't have the ability to simulate many hands taking place across many tables. So in a lot of cases, we have to assume that the true risk premiums at this stage in a tournament are actually slightly higher than what the sim is telling us, because the benefit of just sticking around, maintaining our stack size, is actually greater than what the sim can really account for, because of the fact that there's hands taking place on other tables. So that's the first thing. You have to take a lot of these sims with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but you do have to understand the principles that go into them. And then the second thing, the major thing that we're going to focus a lot of energy on today, is that the absolute number of big blinds that you have in your stack, while it does impact the amount of options that you have, it does dictate to some extent how you have to play, it doesn't change your risk premium. What changes your risk premium is the relationship between your stack and average stack. So what I'm going to do here is compare three different strategies where we have 15 big blinds, and look at how these strategies change when our risk premium is a little different. So this first one that you're going to see here, we are on the bubble with 15 big blinds under the gun, and you can see that we're at a table where the stacks are pretty short. And the reason for using this one as the first example is because this is an example where we have a pretty high risk premium here, right? Under the gun 8, we have 14%, 14%. There's a lot of players here at the table against whom we have a high premium, because we're under a little bit of pressure. There's less upside to us doubling up, right? The upside of a double up is somewhat reduced against a lot of these players. Now, we're not under as much pressure as somebody like the hijack, who only has 6 big blinds here, because the shortest stacks are generally the ones that are under the most pressure around the bubble. But we still have a pretty high risk premium at 14%. And that is putting us in a spot where when we have 15 and the average is pretty short, the average here is 18 big blinds, so we have close to average stack, we are we're able to open about 14%. So it's a little bit tighter than normal, but it's not actually excessively tight. right? Around the bubble, when we're close to average stack, we have a fair amount to lose, but the upside of doubling up, if we were to double through under the gun 7 or double through the low jack or something like that, that would actually be reasonably significant because we would now have quite substantially more than average stack. So we're not going to tighten up excessively here, even though we have that 14% risk premium. Now, the second example is going to have us in the same position under the gun with 15 big blinds, except now average stack is going to be 28 big blinds. So now if we take a look at how much our risk premium has bumped up. We're actually up to about 20% premium here. And this is, by the way, this is at stone bubble. This is one spot till the bubble. So the fact that we are shorter relative to average now around the bubble is actually having a pretty significant impact on our overall risk premium. It's bumping it up to the point where the upside of doubling up now is reduced pretty substantially, actually. And if we add on top of that some element of accounting for the ambiguity of an ICM sim with many tables remaining, our true risk premium might be even higher. Hey, Mathor, welcome. Thanks for being the first one in chat today. And so you can see our range is now way, way tighter. We're actually cutting the range down by about half. We're going from 14% to 7%. So as we get closer to, kind of in that position where we're at almost, I don't want to say the sweet spot because it's the opposite, right? We're at half of average stack, and that really puts us in, a pretty significant amount of jeopardy here as we get towards the bubble. Now, if I do if I make another change to the stacks here and I add in this third sim, which is going to be with 38 big blinds average stack. So we've got 18, 28, and 38 as the average stacks. Our risk premium in this one actually goes down a little bit. So as the average stack goes up, we're starting to get to a point where, our stack is now sort of in that zone where our risk premium is altering. It's not quite as high as it was when we had about half of average, which seems a little counterintuitive that when we are, we're actually going down relative to average stack. It seems like, if we're going to be a short stack, then our risk premium would be higher as our stack size gets smaller. But in fact, it's a lot to do with just the fact that when there's a 38 big blind average, you're going to have a wider discrepancy in stack sizes in a lot of cases. You're going to have a lot of stack sizes, or you're going to have some stack sizes that are really, really small. You're going to have some stack sizes that are a lot bigger, and that's going to have a bit of a knock-on effect on the premiums here. So with the premium at 17%, which is sort of midway in between the other two, you can see our range here is at about 10%, which is basically midway between the other two, right? So the key here is not to look at it in terms of our actual stack size itself. It's to try to get good at estimating what those risk premiums actually are. Try to get accurate in estimating, roughly where our premium is, and we can really start to build good strategies based on that. Another part, by the way, that is influencing this strategy here in the middle to be so tight is the fact that the big blind is the chip leader in this spot. That's going to really count for a lot here. We have a 20% or 19% risk premium, but we're also opening into the chip leader's big blind. In the other spots, we're opening into a pretty short stack in the big blind. So that's going to actually have quite an impact too. Sports fan, does a 10% risk premium pretty much mean that we will need 10% more equity compared to chip EV? Yes, that's exactly what it means. However, the important thing about the implementation of that is that it's on a sliding scale. So the more chips you're risking, the more percentage of your stack you're risking, the more that scale goes up towards 10%, right? So if you're only risking 2 big blinds from your stack, the premium on that 2 big blinds is not an extra 10%. It's maybe an extra 1% or 2% or something, right? So it's a sliding scale as you go up to 10%. It's a curve, and the closer you get to risking your entire stack, the more that premium kicks in, basically. So it doesn't mean that we have to just never invest chips in a pot without an additional 10% equity. It just means that the more chips that we're going to invest, the more of a premium we're paying in order to invest those chips. So it's kind of an asymmetric thing. And the main thing to keep in mind here about ICM, and particularly around bubbles, this is one of the things that is the hardest to wrap your head around sometimes, is that the way that the calculation works is not related to the downside of losing changing, because the downside of losing your stack is always equal to whatever the value of your stack is. What changes is the upside of winning, so the upside of a double up. And this is why when you get to around the bubble, some of the aspects of certain strategies that start to not really feel particularly logical, or maybe not be as logical as you might think, the reason why they look that way quite often is because the upside of winning chips is what's actually changing. And if you look at it this way, it starts to make things a bit clearer. If you look at these three sims here, we have 15 big blinds under the gun. Well, 15 big blinds when average stack is 18, that's a pretty valuable stack. But doubling up to 30 when average stack is 18, that would be quite meaningful, right? That would be a pretty positive development. When we have average stack at 28, well, doubling up from half of average to average, that would be pretty helpful, but not that helpful. And then at the bottom, doubling up from, maybe quite a lot lower than average, like 40% of average, to doubling up to below average, that's not as impactful as either. So you kind of get this situation here where even though our stack at the top is the most valuable of these three scenarios, the upside of a double up in the top scenario is actually more significant, which means the top scenario is the one that has the lowest premium here. We've got 14% compared to about 20 and about 17. So it's not super intuitive here. It's not easily predictable. It's not kind of just a really straightforward equation. But if you start to think of it in terms of those factors, if you start to think of it as what is the upside of a double up here, and you think about, well, doubling up, sometimes if I double up into the chip lead, that's a pretty acceptable possibility in exchange for the risk of potentially busting on the bubble, right? So, you're okay to take that risk sometimes. So there are quite a few instances where your short stack can be more valuable than it seems, or less valuable than it seems, based on the consequences of that double up. So that's 15 big blinds under the gun. And we're looking at the changes in our responses to this situation according to that. Now, what I also want to do is to find some situations where we have 15 bigs and we are essentially responding against an open. So in this case, we're going to get rid of the final table and heads up. We're going to let's look at 15 big blinds playing from the button against an open. So we're going to go depth. Well, we don't have to sort by depth here. We're going to sort for button. Big blinds, let's try exactly 15. High relevance, 15 big blinds. Sorting, okay. Yeah, so we got button, 15 big blinds. We don't want chip EV. Let's just get rid of chip EV for now. And we're going to look at some bubble spots. So this is a perfect example here, right? We've got, first one, we've got average 18 big blinds. Then we're going to look at average 28 if we can find it. Was there one with 28? Well, I guess there isn't one with 28, but let's try, let's actually just be really specific about the ICM parameters here. So we're looking at specifically kind of stone bubble situations here, basically. We're going to look at, let's try, we've got 40 big blinds under the gun there. This might be a pretty good one for just looking at how we respond against that under the gun open. So 40 big blinds under the gun. We're on the button with 15. Then we'll look at 27 average. Yeah, let's try. I want to find something in the 20s as far as average goes here. Oh, whoops! I don't want to keep having these three selected. Let's get rid of those. So yeah, we've still got 15 on the button. Let's try average. We want like 20. Yeah, 27 average seems pretty good, but I want one with 27 average and a stack. An under the gun stack that's kind of like a medium stack. That's kind of okay. This is probably pretty good. This is 14 bigs, 16 bigs, pretty close. Yeah, let's try this one with 14 bigs here. And then let's also go with one of those deeper ones. We have one with 42 bigs here, except that's not quite what we want. 37 bigs, that's probably good. Okay, let's go with that. Welcome. Olha o gajo. I don't speak Portuguese, apologize, but welcome. Thank you. And yes, do hit the like button, the subscribe button, and all that good stuff. So what we've got here is we're going to be on the button and we're going to be facing an open, right? And what we're mostly going to be paying a lot of attention to here is that the response that we have with 15 big blinds against an open here is going to have to be really, really dependent on the opening range that we're seeing. Because as soon as you get into an ICM situation where somebody else has already invested, I nailed it. Great. Oh, excellent. As soon as we get into a situation where somebody else has already invested money in the pot, we have to consider what their ICM situation is and how our response is going to be affected by that. Because in many of these situations, you're going to see that perhaps if they're a bigger stack, the opening range is going to be quite wide, right? So let's look at the risk premiums in this first one. Well, Under the Gun has really tiny risk premiums because they are way above average in this short stack average scenario. And we, once again on the button, have about this 14% risk premium, right? So again, we're kind of in a situation where, generally speaking, if we are sitting on 15 bigs with the average at 18 here, premium is going to be in that 14% area. So it's pretty high. It's not astronomically high, but it is high. Not as high as the Under the Gun 7 or something like that because they're a super micro stack here, but you can see it's a pretty high premium. So let's take a look at our response against an open here, first of all. Let's just get rid of these bottom two as well. Let's delete them. Okay, there we go. So folds around to us here, and there's a couple of things that are pretty relevant or pretty evident, first of all, about this strategy. The first thing is that we have no flatting here, right? We're not flatting a raise at 15 big blinds. And the reason for that, even though we're on the button, is simply that one of the fundamental aspects of ICM here is that, or one of the fundamental aspects of ICM in every spot, is that if we are under a lot of ICM pressure, if we are experiencing a significant risk premium, then the subsequent streets, multiple streets of post-flop play, is only going to hurt us more and more and more. So we have less incentive to play multiple streets when there's ICM in play. And this is really important because quite often what people do is they pretty much resort to, I don't want to get it in, but I don't want to fold. And so they end up calling. And that becomes the worst play in a lot of cases. If we look at certain hands here, right? If you look at a hand that's like kind of awkward, kind of uncomfortable, like ace jack offsuit here, well, we've got a scenario here where I don't remember exactly what buy-in level we used as our example for the ICM sims here. But the EV here in terms of dollar value, let's say, I would assume this is probably like the dollar value here is probably something in the region of, I think it's a 1K. Actually, I think it's a 1K buy-in. I think that's what we used for the bubble sims here. So the all-in, you can see, is making 5.3K in EV here. But calling, look how much less it's making. It's making like a $1,900 loss compared to shoving there. Even 3-betting to a different size here is making a lot more than calling. There's a huge gap between these aggressive actions and a passive action here. And if we look at something else, like some other hand, the gap might be even bigger. If we look at, well, actually King 10 suited is not in that category, but pocket sixes, well, pocket sixes is actually losing as a call here. So even though ace jack offsuit would be winning as a call, pocket sixes is losing, which is quite interesting. Pocket fives is losing. Sevens, that's really interesting. So sevens is winning as a call, and the gap is not as big. The gap is quite close. Ace nine suited is slightly winning as a call here. So certainly there's a lot of variation here in terms of which exact hands are doing well and which hands are not. But you can see that there's always a gap there. You can see calling is not a great play here. Even if we look at the top of our jamming range, queens, that's making like 36K in EV, There's about a 2K gap between shoving queens here and flatting them. So we don't want to flat anything. The second thing is we have this very small non-all-in 3-bet, 4.5 here. The reason for that existing is because when we have aces and also when we have kings, we don't really want to be forced to just shove because we just don't really get much action. So we do create this very small 3-bet bluff range or very small 3-bet range that basically amounts to aces and then a little bit of some suited aces as a bluff. That's basically the only hands that are bluffing here. So that's kind of how the strategy looks here, facing a big stack. And obviously we have to note that the hands that we're shoving here are not exclusively hands that we're comfortable getting it in with. Like, we're not only able to shove hands that are hoping to get called here. We are shoving some hands that are hoping to get a fold. And a pretty baseline level sort of assumption for most ICM spots is that it's very rare that the only hands that you should get it in with are hands that are very happy to get it in. There should always be some region of hands that you're getting it in with, but you're not really very happy about it. And if there isn't, that's probably a sign that you're getting it in too tight. So that's a pretty good rule of thumb there. But as you can see, because we're facing a pretty wide open here, we are able to shove quite a bit. And if we look at what happens if we do shove, the under the gun player is forced to fold, 3/4 of the time. And even if they call off sixes plus, ace 10 suited, ace jack off, king queen suited, we're still getting tons and tons of folds here, right? So it kind of explains why we're able to shove these hands that we do shove. Now, if we look at the second example here, where the average stack was about 27 big blinds, and we look at the premium here, we're now at a premium of 17.8. So our premium has gone up a little bit. However, we're still facing an under the gun stack who is going to have the ability to open fairly wide, except look at their opening range now. They're not opening to the same stack that they the same size that they previously were. They're not opening to a min raise. They're opening to 2.3. They're also only opening 26% instead of the 34% that they previously were opening. So the opening range is tighter and the size is a little bit bigger, and our risk premium has gone slightly up. So take a look at our strategy. It's definitely tighter, right? We do have that non-all-in 3-bet exclusively with aces and then a tiny frequency of a couple of bluffs. And the shoving range now is only 7%. We're no longer shoving sixes or sevens. We're not shoving ace jack off anymore, except for a tiny frequency. We're basically only going with eights plus, ace queen off, ace 10 suited, and some of these hands. Now again though, even though our shoving range is tighter, it still contains some hands that are hoping to get a fold, even though we actually have one big blind less here than we did before. So even in situations like this, we still have to have some hands that shove that are not happy to get called, right? We have to have that king jack suited in there. It's actually making $400 to shove king jack suited. It's making $2,700 to shove king queen suited here. So there's big margins at stake here. If we fold a hand like king queen suited, we're folding a very, very profitable spot. So even though we're facing a slightly larger open and a slightly tighter range, we're not tightening up excessively here, right? And if we shove, if we look at what happens facing that shove, the original raiser is going to fold pretty much the same frequency, about 75% of the time or so. And it's actually a fairly similar call-off range here. So we're still getting, roughly the same amount of folds as we previously would. And of course, that's going to work pretty well in our favor here. Now, one notable thing about our shoving range is that if we go back one step here, oops, there we go. Our shoving range is more likely to include hands like ace 10 suited, king jack suited, ace queen off. These hands have good blocking power, so they get more folds. Hands like sevens is losing here. Sixes is losing here. Hands that don't have an ace or even a king in them are much less inclined to be good shoving hands here. Even pocket eights is only making less than $400, but that's less than half of what ace 10 suited is making. So having an ace is super powerful here just because not only do we block the calling off hands that the under the gun player is going to have, but we also block some of the strong hands from the players in the small blind and the big blind, which is a helpful thing here as well. But again, here we're seeing no flatting. We're not hedging and just flatting off 15 big blinds here. So that's important. Now, finally, we've got this situation where we are now at a even higher risk premium because the average stack has gone up. So in this case, we're at close to 20% premium. However, the interesting variable here is that the under the gun player actually has a very high premium themselves, or a fairly high premium at about 15%. So they are now only opening 12%, right? They are only opening a very tight range themselves here because they have, stacks behind them that can pressure them. They're under a lot more pressure here. And when that's the case, look how tight we get when we're shoving into a tight opening range and we are also under a lot of risk premium. Look how absurdly tight our shoving range becomes. We are still clicking it back with aces, and we're still, finding a couple of click back fold hands in there. But we're only getting it in with queens, kings, and ace king. And that's because the opening range is now so much tighter, right? We went from a super wide opening range where we were getting it in fairly wide, and we were happy to shove hands that aren't really exactly excited to get called. Whereas now, we're incredibly tight now. We're only shoving 2% of hands. We're folding 97% of the time. And the biggest thing here is that, I mentioned before, we have to shove some hands that aren't happy to get called. In this case, it might seem like we're not doing that. It might seem like we're not shoving any hands that are hoping to get a fold. But in reality, ace king is hoping to get a fold here. If we think about the call off range, under the gun 8 only calls off with queens plus and ace king. So if you have ace king, you're actually hoping to get a fold. You're hoping to get jacks, 10s, 9s to fold, those types of hands. You're not hoping to get action here by any means. And the opening range is just so tight that we're really kind of reduced in what we can actually get it in with. And yeah, risk premium versus risk premium, basically. Yeah, it's really just a super heavy, intense risk premium kind of a spot where we have about 20%. Under the gun has about 15. So everybody has to be really, really tight. So there's a big, big difference here between getting it in versus a player who is able to open really wide, and then getting it in versus a player who is able to or is forced to open a lot tighter. That's quite an important aspect of this whole equation here. We have to be really, really mindful of what the opening range actually looks like. Now, the next factor that I want to look at is what happens when we're in the big blind, because obviously being in the big blind is quite an important scenario to look at in any circumstance. And when we're in the big blind with 15 bigs, there's quite obviously going to be a lot of spots that are pretty challenging as far as knowing what our big blind defending range is going to look like. So I'm going to look at, again, 3 different scenarios. We're going to look at one here where we have average of 18. We're going to look at one where we have average of 28. And then we're going to try to find one with a deeper average here. 36, that's probably pretty good. Yeah, average of 36, that seems reasonable. Okay, so we're going to compare there. So in this case, we're looking primarily at what our defense range is going to look like. So open, and we're in the big blind. So we do start with 15 here. And if you look at under the guns open, again, they are opening pretty wide, 28% here, because they don't have a ton of risk premium. And we in the big blind are faced with a pretty high premium against them of 14% or so, but not super high. We are in that kind of middle stack region here where there is still some upside to us doubling up. So if we look at our defending strategy here, it's definitely significantly tighter than usual, but there are still hands in there that are shoving with the expectation of fold equity, right? We're shoving ace 3, ace deuce suited, ace 7 suited in there specifically, which is quite interesting. We've got pocket 3s shoving as well. So there are some very specific hands that are shoving here with a bit more of a desire to target specific hands in the opening range. But we're certainly going to have that shoving range. We're certainly not just going to play call or fold here in the big blind. And if you look at the response, villain is forced to fold a ton here. When we shove our ace deuce, ace 3, ace 7, they're folding, hands like ace 10 suited. They're folding ace 10 off. They're folding king jack suited. So there's a lot of pretty good hands that they are forced to fold just because they're opening quite wide and we're shoving with a decently strong range. So we are certainly going to be still having some of those hands that are not happy to get called. We're actually shoving queen 9 suited quite a bit here. And, queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited. So we're definitely still shoving with some expectation of fold equity, but the region of hands that we're doing that with is reasonably light. We're not exactly going to need to have too strong of a hand here, particularly because of that opening range being relatively wide. So we're not going too far overboard and tightening up too much here. We're still defending hands like 5-3 suited, ace-8 off. This looks a bit like a kind of a cash game defending range, right? I think it's actually quite interesting and useful to have a bit of a familiarity with cash game defending ranges, because of the fact that once you start to be under some ICM pressure, sometimes your defending range or your defending frequency will start to look a bit like what it would do in a deep stacked environment with rake in play. So, it does occasionally happen there. But this is the spot where we have, high but not astronomical premium. If we go to the second spot here, in this case, we're going to have a premium of a little bit higher. It's about 17%, right? So we're now against, we're at a 17% premium, pretty intense ICM pressure here. And if we look at the under the gun player, they are kind of a medium stack at this point. They're not under that much pressure. They're only under pressure against the button here, who's the one player that covers them. And everybody else, they're able to put some pressure on. So they're now opening 24% under the gun, which is a pretty decently wide range. They're opening to 2.2 bigs, and they do have some hands in here that are just kind of blocker orientated that are going to get a lot of folds. They have king 4 suited in there, ace 5 off. There's not a lot of suited connector type stuff in there, so they're not going to have a lot of hands that play particularly well post flop. When it folds around to us here, look at how tight we are now, right? Let's just compare the opening range to the previous spot. They're opening 24% compared to 28%, and our risk premium has gone from 14% to 17%. And on top of that, the open size has gone from 2x to 2.2. So we've got 3 factors all converging on each other. You've got our risk premium, the opening range, and the open size. All 3 of those factors are leaning us in the same direction, which is tighter, right? We're leaning tighter because of all of those factors. And now we're really not defending very much. We're not even close to the same kind of defending range that we previously had. We are still shoving. And, this is kind of an important part of this, is that it's not like we're just only shoving for value now, right? We still have to shove some hands that are hoping to get a fold, because if we don't, then how can we expect to actually get called when we shove our good hands, right? We still have this non-all-in 3-bet to 5.5, which is kind of crazy. But we're shoving, a lot of these hands that are pretty vulnerable. Kings is shoving. Suited ace hands are shoving. And we're really not defending very much. We're even folding hands like 10-9 suited. We just can't realize very much equity here. Very, very difficult spot to call and just try to see a flop and try to continue, try to realize some equity and so on. Not really going to be a substantial change here. Not really going to be a substantial opportunity here for us to actually see flops and realize equity. We're actually folding a pair quite often here as well, deuces and threes. So definitely tightening up quite a bit. Now, if we look at the final spot here is one where we're still at a high premium. We're at about 20% again here. So we're at pretty much an equivalent kind of a risk premium. However, now we have this big stack under the gun. We have the 73 big blind stack under the gun, who's way above average. And even though we're not under, maximum risk premium here, they're able to open 29% of hands. They're able to open more suited connectors, more offsuit aces, and even like queen 6 suited is mixing opens here. They're also opening slightly larger, which is going to affect things to some degree. So now look at us, right? We are basically not even calling at all. And then there's a key dynamic here of why we're not calling at all. The crucial number one thing of why we're not calling at all here is that when our opponent outchips us by so much, when they are so far ahead of us in terms of their ability to apply ICM pressure to us, we have no real incentive to play post-flop against them, because as soon as we do, they get to win the pot at such a high frequency. And this is a pretty fundamental aspect of ICM here. It relates to what I said earlier about the more streets of post-flop play we have to try to navigate while under ICM pressure, the more it starts to hurt us. And it also kind of invokes a concept that I like to talk about here, which it's as close as possible to a concept that I created. I was the first one to talk about this, I think. I call it risk advantage, which is basically the under the gun player here has a very low risk premium against us, and the big blind has, or we have a very high risk premium against them. So they have a lot of leverage, a lot of pressure that they can exert over us, and we can't do the same in return. It's not two-way pressure, it's one-way pressure. You win by not playing, says Oyo Gajo. Yeah, I mean, it kind of is that way, and especially here, when we're talking about a big field ICM circumstance, we're talking about a sim that is inherently a little bit inaccurate, because ICM sims can't easily cope with the fact that we've got a lot of tables playing out at the same time. It's actually, it's entirely reasonable here that we could consider being even more conservative than this, right? We could justify taking some of these hands that are on the borderline and potentially folding them, especially as the field gets larger and larger. And then as the field gets smaller, we might come closer to this particular sim or closer to this exact circumstance here. But the main variable here that's affecting things is the fact that when we go post-flop, they are going to be able to play so aggressively, and we are not really going to be able to realize much equity at all. So in this particular case, there's very little opportunity for us to actually see a flop and win the pot at any frequency at all. So we simply have to more or less play push-fold. And quite often the spots where you actually do end up being forced to play push-fold are spots where exactly this type of thing is happening. Push-fold is not really as much of a thing in modern tournaments as people think it is. It's certainly not a particularly good strategy in very many situations, but the situations where you can't really justify playing post-flop certainly are ones where push-fold strategies start to become a bit better. However, we do still have aces 3-betting to a non-all-in size here. We're making it like half of our stack. And this is kind of a crazy spot. Like, if we look at this range here, look at it. We've got aces, and then we've got a couple of suited ace bluffs. Like, we're just mixing in suited ace bluffs. I wonder what under the gun does when we 3-bet small here. Yeah, so when we 3-bet really tiny, or when we 3-bet to 5.75, they shove a lot of hands. This is kind of an unsolved strategy here, because there's a lot of stuff that's sort of mixing. There's a lot of actions that are being taken that are actually negative EV. So it's a really low frequency line. It's not really not really a line that we want to take too seriously here, but when we do face a shove, we literally have aces that calls it off. We actually call it off with ace jack suited as well, which is a little bit weird. And there's a tiny bit of pocket queens in there, but other than that, we pretty much just have aces or a bluff there. So kind of a crazy 3-bet line for us. But that's the kind of the perspective here on the big blind defense strategies. When our risk premium is really high and we're specifically facing an opener that has a very low premium against us and that can put a lot of pressure on us, we just have to defend really, really tight. And we basically just don't even defend anything by passively calling here. Now, one other thing that I want to cover, because we got maybe another 10-15 minutes or so, is I want to cover some micro stack scenarios. So I want to look at some spots where we have a really short stack, right? So we're going to get rid of that big blind. We're going to look at anything where hero has... Let's try, I guess that's sorting by average stack, not by hero stack size. But anyway, let's look at, we're under the gun here, and we're going to find like some super micro stack spots. Okay, so we have 2 big blinds under the gun here. That's actually going to be kind of funny. 2 big blinds with 17 big blind average. Let's try like 4 big blinds with 29, 5 big blinds with 19, 5 big blinds with 28, 7 big blinds with 18, and then let's try 8 big blinds with 27. All right, cool. So we got a whole bunch of micro stack spots. This is going to be the ones that have really high premiums, right? This is likely to be, oops, that's the wrong sim. I didn't mean to include that one. These are going to be some of the sims that, that we really see these like crazy, like really high risk premiums, right? And this is another thing to note here, is that the premiums in these sims are actually, again, they are not accounting for the fact that there's action on multiple tables at the same time. So the real risk premiums here are going to be higher than what they actually seem like they should be. Now, this is a really interesting and kind of ambiguous spot where the sim here is not fully accounting. Like, this is a great example actually of the sim not being able to fully account for multiple tables going on, because let's say that this is a live tournament, right? We know that live tournaments have big blind ante. We know that when we're under the gun, we are going to be in the big blind next hand. The advantage of doubling up here is virtually nothing, because we're going to be at 4 big blinds the next hand, one way or the other. The ICM sim, however, is not able to account for the fact that if we're on the stone bubble here, and in this case, there's 151 players in the tournament, there are probably about 17 tables, 16 tables, something like that, in this tournament right now. And that means there's 15, 14, 16 other tables on which action is taking place. And it's very likely, it's not 100% likely, but it's very likely in a circumstance like this, that if we fold, we will cash the tournament, because somebody at one of those other tables is probably going to bust on this next hand. It's not a guarantee, but it is a probability, right? Especially if the field gets even bigger. If you're on the stone bubble here and it's the main event and there's 1,500 players left in the tournament, there's like so many, like an insane number of tables going on, 160, 170 tables in play. Somebody's going to bust at this point. So realistically, it's not out of the question that we should even be substantially tighter than this here. I do think that you can make an argument that with this specific spot, you pretty much should only get it in with aces. And I don't even know if that's the case here. Like, this is almost like satellite levels of risk premium, in that you know that you're going to be all in on the next hand because you're going to be in the big blind next hand. But you also know if you fold here, there's a very high chance somebody else on one of these other tables is going to bust, and you're going to make the money. And then you also know that even if you double up here, you're still going to have 4 big blinds the next hand and be putting 2 of those into the pot in the big blind. So there's certainly, I think, at least some kind of a coherent argument for folding almost everything, including potentially even aces. The other aspect that you have to be aware of here is even a hand like aces, particularly in instances like this, you're not going to go heads up very often. You're basically guaranteed to play 3 ways. Like, if you have ace king here, it does make money to get it in theory, but if you think about it, like, when you get all in, the player next to you, they're supposed to actually fold 97% of the time. They may not do that. The low jack here, again, they're supposed to fold 97. They may not. This player is supposed to fold 97. Cutoff is supposed to fold 96. Everybody's supposed to be really, really tight against you here. And they're also supposed to isolate you quite a bit. They're supposed to basically just click it back to play a heads up all in pot against you in this case. But a lot of players won't do that. A lot of players in, let's say, the hijack, some of these other positions, they'll just call. And when that happens, there's a good chance that maybe you end up going 3 ways to the flop. And when you go 3 ways, like, let's just look at, like, when the small blind calls here, the big blind is able to call you or call this extra 1 big blind 49% of the time. Yeah, you might triple up to 7 big blinds or whatever, but you are going to be at risk. Like, more often, you're going to bust more often than you would think here in practice because of the possibility of more 3-way play. So I do feel like even this absurdly tight strategy here is too loose for most realistic scenarios here under the gun. The caveat would be that if you're playing a very small field tournament with only 3 or 4 tables in play by the time you get to the money, then this strategy is probably going to become a lot better because there's far fewer tables in play and there's a lot lower chance of you actually making it into the money by way of somebody else busting. So the smaller the field gets, the closer we should go to this type of strategy. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, our second spot here, we now have 4 big blinds, and we're at a slightly deeper average. So in this case, we are going a little bit wider. We actually do have just a min raise with aces here, which is quite interesting. So Shelly Aaron says, might have might have missed this. Oh yes, okay. So Shelly, thanks for mentioning that. That plan is actually taking a different shape now, in that we are going to have a special session coming up. This is going to be next Wednesday. We're going to have a special session with myself and our Octopi founder, Victoria Lifshitz, our chief product officer, Johan Schultz Pedersen. And we're going to have a session where we're going to talk through some of the recent upgrades to the platform. You guys are, if you're a subscriber, you're going to get an invite to that session in your email inbox soon. I'm going to be hosting that. So that session is actually kind of taking a new format now, and we're going to start to we're going to go through some stuff like that. But certainly we are going to continue to discuss some of these study methodologies going forward here. I apologize for kind of shifting around the plan here. I shouldn't have like teased you guys with saying that this was going to be the plan for today if it wasn't 100% confirmed. Apologize for that. You got the invite. Yeah, it will be recorded for sure. I believe that the plan is for that to it's either going to go up on the YouTube channel or it's going to be circulated within the user base. Like, we're going to send it to you guys in email, or I can't say for sure exactly which one we're going to do, but that session is going to, it's going to cover some of the product upgrades. It's going to cover some advice from Victoria and Johan as well. So Coy Larson says, looking forward to Wednesday. Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to hosting that. It's going to be pretty early for me here in Vegas. It's going to be 8 a.m. Pacific time, but I'm happy to get up early and hang out with you guys and get that session done. So yeah, we've got this situation here with 4 big blinds. Risk premium now, we are at 23%, super high premium. So again, we're really, really tight. What was the premium in the last one? Actually, I didn't even check that. Premium here is 21%. So premium with 4 big blinds here is actually even higher, just based on being further away from average. So we're going with 5% here. We do actually maybe have a little bit more fold equity here, because I don't think we're going to be getting called 100% of the time by the big blind. Yeah, wow, the big blind's actually only supposed to call us 19% of the time. Oh, 100 in Vegas. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so the big blind's actually supposed to call only 19% of the time. This is one where, again, I think in practice, people are not going to be this tight. Like, the big blind is just not going to fold ace-10 off to 4 big blinds, just one way or the other. Like, they're just not folding those hands. So I do feel like, again, there's probably a pretty decent incentive for us to go slightly tighter than what the sim is telling us here. Now, this next one, we have 5, and we have a premium of 22.8%. So 5 big blinds at an average of about 20-ish. Yeah, very, very tight again, 6%. But we do have that min raise with aces and a couple of bluffs again. So that policy of min raising aces and having also a couple of bluffs in there still happening. Then if we go to the next one, this time we have 5 bigs, and the average stack is getting a bit deeper here. This time we have a premium of 23.6, so super high premium again. And we're still going with about 5%. So it's quite rare that our all-in range goes below that 5% threshold. 9s plus, ace-10 suited, ace-queen off. That's a pretty reasonable range here. So we do see that coming up fairly often. Next one we have 7 big blinds. So we have a little bit more here. Premium is at 20%. So premium is not as high as it was, but it's still very high. And you can see, again, we're still playing a decent amount of shoves here. We're still shoving some hands that we're not exactly excited to get called by. But one of the benefits that we have at this point is that the big blind is really shallow. So if we do shove, the big blind is only going to call off, wow, look at that. They're only going to call off queens plus and ace-king suited here. Insanely tight call-off range, which is certainly helping us to be able to shove a little bit more here. And then finally, we look at our last one. This time we have 8 under the gun, and we actually have a little bit more in the way of min-raising here. A couple of hands min-raising and then folding. Ace is still min-raising. And we only have 4% shove, so we're being pretty tight here on account of that 22% premium. So again, these premiums are super high. We're going to see above 20% a lot of the time when we have less than 10 bigs on the bubble. Pretty consistent there that premium is going to jump up to that 20 to 25% region. So just being really aware of how high those premiums do go when we're at this type of shallow stack here is quite important. And then as you saw before, when we had about 15 big blinds, it was surprisingly difficult for that premium to really jump up to 22, 24% here. It was mostly staying in that 14 to 18% kind of region. So we weren't going to be quite as tight. We were definitely going to be tight, but not absurdly tight. So overall, I think the main principle to keep in mind here is that idea that we're always going to have some hands that have to get it in that are not happy to get it in. And if we tighten up to the point where we're only, we're either super excited to get it in or we're not getting it at all, we're probably a little bit too tight. But it's also worthwhile to just be aware that all of these sims, whichever ICM sims you look at, they're all going to have some element of inaccuracy because of the fact that ICM can't take into account multiple hands taking place at the same time. And this is why it's so important to understand the principles of ICM and how the calculations actually work, because it helps us to estimate and approximate what the impact of these other hands going on at the same time is actually going to be. So that is probably the final thought that I would want to leave you guys with here, because it is super important when it comes to overall ICM strategies. So I think that's a good spot for us to leave it off here for today. Thank you everybody for being here. We will be back with that special session next week, but there's also going to be the weekly session here on Friday as well. So nothing's going to change about that. What I will do is that anything that does not get covered in that Wednesday session that relates to study processes and how to study effectively, we will talk about on Friday. So I'll make that kind of agreement with you guys that whatever ends up not being addressed during that Wednesday session, we'll kind of make it up on Friday, and I'll make sure that I give you guys a full perspective here on some of the best ways that I think you guys can take advantage of the tools that you have with Octopi. So that's a good spot to wrap it up. Thank you guys. So Sports Fan says, I'm playing in a 1700 main event next Saturday in Cherokee. It'll be the biggest buy-in I've ever played. Any advice? Yeah, so the biggest advice I would say is don't assume everybody else is way better than you, because that won't be true. Just recognize that the main thing that changes as buy-in levels go up is not necessarily the quality of the players. It's going to be the relationship between how many pros and how many recs are in the player pool. And the pros are going to be better pros, but the recs are still going to be recs. There's still going to be bad players. There's still going to be a ton of bad players in a 1700. It's just going to be a different ratio of one to the other. So don't overhaul your game. Don't knit it up. Don't play super tight. Just play it normally. Have confidence. And just recognize that it's just another tournament. Go out there, enjoy it, and hopefully you run good. So good luck. Chad Hunter says, Mental Health Matt, that's a blast from the past. I don't really go by Mental Health Matt anymore, but thank you. Am I taking guests here? Have I seen D-Laz's Octopi vids? I don't know what you mean by am I taking guests, but I have not seen his Octopi vids yet. We will, we have a lot of people out there who we're kind of connected with, some affiliates who are making some videos about Octopi. I'll check those out. I know he knows what he's talking about, so I'll check those out. Chad Owner says, Sports Fan, maybe assume they have more bullets though. No, I wouldn't really assume that. Like, I don't think you really should take into account like how many bullets somebody has in a tournament. Like, yeah, people are sometimes going to punt because they think that somehow they're supposed to play a freeze out differently than a re-entry tournament, which is not really how it works. But I wouldn't really say that's something that's going to have a meaningful impact. It might just mean that some spots where you expect them to fold more, maybe they don't fold as much. Hard to say. Anyway, thank you guys. Appreciate you all being here. I'll see you guys on Wednesday for the special session, and then I will also see you again on Friday next week. So thanks everybody. Good luck for the week, and I will talk to you all soon. Appreciate it.